All right. Well, you may remember that when we left off last time, we were with Abraham in Genesis 18, where he was having a conversation with God about what God was going to do with the city of Sodom. Now we're going to find out what the answer to that is. And then we're going to take a look at Genesis 22, and that'll kind of finish the Abraham cycle, and then we'll go on to the Jacob cycle. So the book of Genesis is kind of structured in several parts. There's the prologue to the history of Israel, Genesis 1 through 11. There's the Abraham cycle of stories, the Jacob cycle of stories, and then the Joseph cycle of stories, and that finishes off the book of Genesis. Isaac is kind of in there, but he's not like a major character. That's why we move from Abraham to Jacob, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. So we pick up the story with Abraham in Genesis 19, and I'm going to treat this very briefly because I want to get to 22, which is actually more important. So what goes on in Genesis 19, 1 through 22 is kind of interesting. And I kind of debated about whether I was actually going to include this or not, because it's kind of weird and strange and different and odd, like a lot of things in the Old Testament. So here it is. I'll read part of it to you, and then I'll say a few things about it. So this is what happens. Abraham's nephew Lot is in the city of Sodom. He's bought a really nice condo in downtown Sodom. He's not really into suburban living, and this is kind of what happens here. This is Genesis 19:4 and following, just to make it brief. But before they lay down, so the Lot's there. These two angels have come into the city to be with Lot, to tell him to leave, and this is what happens. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them." Lot went out with the men at the entrance and shut the door after him, and he said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out, and you can do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has come to be our judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man. Lot drew near to break the door down. But when the men reached out their hands and brought Lot out of the house, and with them shut the door, and they struck blind the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. So this is kind of an odd scene. Let me say a few things about it, and then we'll go on to Genesis 22. So we have Lot here in the house. We have these two angels who have come to be with him. A crowd of people gathers outside Lot's house. And basically what they are proposing to do is they're proposing to essentially rape the two guests. Now the question here why are they doing this? One way, of course, of looking at this would be to sort of say this is what's really going on in Sodom has something to do with homosexuality. I don't really think that's what it is. I think there's something else going on here that we want to pay attention to. I think that one of the things that we get all the way through the book of Genesis is little pictures of the effects of sin on humankind. And I think what's really going on in this picture is this. This is a picture of one of the effects of sin, and it looks something like this. Essentially, what's going on is that the two men, right, are sojourners. That is, they're from another place, and so they're in Sodom. And that means, of course, they're what? Vulnerable. And what the men of Sodom are proposing to do, they are proposing to rape them, but I don't believe it has much to do with what we would now call homosexuality. I think it has something to do with something rather different, and that is the purpose here is they're going to rape these sojourners so as to humiliate them. That is, what they're proposing to do is kind of a sort of gratuitous act of cruelty. And I think Genesis is helping us to see that this is another one of the effects of sin on humankind. One of its effects is it stifles the conscience. It makes us kind of hardened to other people, and therefore it makes us capable of inflicting cruelty on other people. And so Sodom is sort of like a city where, in effect, cruelty is the name of the game. And so the city is, in fact, destroyed. But I think there's something really important going on here about just how blind and corrupt human beings can be. It's not coincidental, and we'll get to this later on in the book of Exodus. Exodus 22:21, God says this: "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Notice what God's telling the people of Israel. Look, you were vulnerable people in the land of Egypt. You were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And what did the Egyptians do to you? Well, they took advantage of you. They turned you all into slaves. They had no interest in your welfare. They put you all to work, and if y'all, kind of died off building their stuff, they didn't care. They had no real interest in you. God's reminding his own people, right? Look, remember how you were treated when you were sojourners. Don't you ever do anything like that ever again to any sojourners who are among you. You're supposed to be different. That is, one of the things that God's calling his people against, right, is one of the sort of like basic human temptations and failures, right? Our temptation to take advantage of people who are weak and defenseless. And God's telling his people, right, don't you ever, ever do that. If for no other reason, you should remember what happened to you back in the land of Egypt. Well, the Abraham story kind of comes to essentially a conclusion in Genesis 22, which I want to spend more time on because it's actually more important. Genesis 22, I think, is one of the most important chapters in the whole of the Old Testament, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time with it. So here's part of what happens in Genesis 22. This is sometimes called the sacrifice of Isaac. That's actually not correct because Isaac's actually never sacrificed. Within Judaism, this is, I think, more accurately referred to as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. So here's part of the story. I'll read it to you and I'll say some things about it. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." There's the instruction. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And they cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abram lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took in his hand the knife and the fire. So they went on, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" It's like, okay, we got the knife and the fire. Dad, where's the sacrifice? Okay. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went on, both of them together. When they came to the place which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac. That's where the word Akedah comes from. Isaac here is bound his son and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called from heaven to him and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went over and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Let's take a look at this puzzling and in some ways disturbing story. So a little bit of background here just to kind of make this make a little bit more sense. One of the things that we know about the native religion of Palestine or Canaan is that child sacrifice was practiced for quite some time. Children were often sacrificed to the god Moloch, M-O-L-E-C-H, and actually this actually went on for quite some time, even within Israel. The Israelites were actually tempted to adopt the practice of child sacrifice over time. And they did this because the idea, right, is if you offered a god something that was valuable to you, you'd get like a really big blessing in return. That's the idea here. So Israel has to struggle with child sacrifice for actually quite some time. So that's kind of the background to all this. But I want to put this in Abraham's own context and see what is going on. We're told here that this is a test for Abraham. That is, God is, in effect, seeing, right, if Abraham really trusts him. And so Abraham is told to do something that's quite difficult. And I like the way that Genesis 22:2 puts this. Take your son, your only son, whom you've been waiting now for 20 years, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and there offer him as a burnt offering. That is, in effect, right, Isaac represents for Abraham the only thing, the only means that he can see by which God's promise to him is going to be fulfilled. Is he willing to give it up? That's the test. That is Abraham willing to trust God completely, totally, absolutely? That's what's going on here. And so they go, and another important detail here is Abraham is told to go to offer his son on Mount Moriah. Later on in 2 Chronicles 3, not 2 Corinthians, 2 Chronicles 3, we're going to learn a really important fact about Mount Moriah. It's the mountain on which the temple is built. The very place where Isaac was almost sacrificed is the place on which Israel's temple is built, which is immensely significant. Now, notice what happens here as we get to the end of the story. Abraham says something in response to Isaac's question. Isaac says, as I mentioned, right, Dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says something that's really interesting. He says, "The Lord will provide the sacrifice, my son." Now notice what that means. Abraham is in effect saying, right, well, if I actually have to go through this act of sacrificing Isaac, what I just said will be true. Because, right, how did I get Isaac? He was provided by God, right? So if I end up having to sacrifice Isaac, then God will have provided the sacrifice. But also, alternatively, right, if something else happens and Isaac isn't sacrificed, well, God will have provided the sacrifice as well. So, in effect, Abraham sort of shows his trust by basically sort of like leaving it open to allow God to do whatever he's going to do. That's the really important thing here. And then, towards the end of the story, just as Abraham's about to carry out this act, the angel calls to him from heaven and says, in effect, hold on, okay, don't sacrifice Isaac. You don't need to do that. Actually, I never intended for you to do it. Stop. And then the angel says to him something that I think is really important that we'll want to dwell on for just a minute. The angel says to him, "Now I know that you fear God, now that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." This word fear is going to be really important as we go on into the Old Testament, so I want to say just a little bit about what it means. One of the challenges of reading the Bible in English, of course, is we're not reading it in its original language, right? We're reading the Old Testament, originally written in Hebrew, translated in English, and then we get to the New Testament, originally written in Greek, translated in English, and so we have to deal with translation problems. But the word here that's used for fear is really interesting. It's one of these words that sort of has like multiple meanings and all at once. So the word fear here means it's a combination of awe, reverence, respect, and also fear in the sense of, maybe thinking about this, say you're one day, you're wandering around the Florida Capitol. I don't know why you'd be wandering around the Florida Capitol, but let's say you are. And, you turn the corner one day and you kind of like bump into the governor, right? Excuse me, Governor, I'm sorry. Sorry I ran into you. You're going to have something of a sense of kind of like awe, reverence, respect, and somewhat, an element of fear there because it's like a really important person that you don't normally see. So that's the idea here. So the idea here is that the thing that's been proven true about Abraham here is that he has a proper awe, reverence, respect for God. So that's one thing. There's another element here that's also really important, which is one of the reasons why I say this is one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament. Abraham gives a name to this place. And the name that he gives to it is, as we learn in Genesis 22:14, the Lord will provide, as it is said this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. That is, we're being told here something really important, and we won't really know the full answer to this till we get to the New Testament. And the issue here is this. We're being told here, right, that a sacrifice is needed. Somebody really does need to make a sacrifice here. But it's not going to be us. The sacrifice is going to be made, but it will be provided by God. Whatever the sacrifice is that somehow is so desperately needed in this situation, it will not come from us, and we will not be making it. The sacrifice will come from God. And as I say, we'll get the answer to that question when we get to the New Testament. So really important chapter that's getting us prepared, obviously, for Christ's death on the cross. Now, let's get into the Jacob cycle really quickly. Jacob is a really interesting character, and I want us to trace a little bit about him because he's a really important character. And so I want to take a look at Jacob here and see how he develops over time, because there's an important theology that's at work here. We'll take a look here clearly just a little bit about the story of Jacob's birth, because that'll tell us some important things about us. So fast forward a little bit to Genesis 25:19. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, is pregnant, and here's what happens. There's kind of like she's pregnant with twins, and there's kind of this struggle going on in the womb. And so here's what happens. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived, and the children struggled together within her. And she said, "If it is this way, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Kind of a reversal there. When her days came to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out all red, all his body like a hairy cloak, and they called his name Esau, which essentially means red in Hebrew. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So Esau comes out of the womb, but guess what happens? his brother Jacob is like grasping him by the heel. Jacob is one of these kids that constantly says, "Wait, no, pay attention to me. You're not paying enough attention to me. Look at me." And here's what happens. So Esau comes out, Jacob comes out, and so his name is called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So really important fact here about Jacob, and we'll just kind of want to remember this as we go through the story. Jacob's name is difficult to translate, but it means something like grabber. Jacob is a grabber in the sense that, right, Jacob is a very sort of selfish, manipulative person who's always scheming about how he can get what he wants out of any given situation. And his name kind of advertises the fact, okay? Now, this is by way of saying that we have to be really careful here about sort of adopting Old Testament figures, or really any biblical figure, and simply think of it as sort of like a moral example, okay? Jacob is not a moral example. Okay, God's not calling us to be self-centered manipulators, okay? Really important to make that point clear, right? But something happens over the course of time that we find out. So one episode from Jacob's life. Jacob and his mother Rebekah scheme, and I emphasize the word scheme, to steal the patriarchal blessing that should have gone to Esau, the older son, and they make sure that Jacob gets it because Jacob operates under the idea that whatever he's going to get out of life, he's going to have to grab it. Now, the thing that's really important here to remember, and we'll see this as we walk through Jacob's story, is that Jacob's whole perception of reality is actually off. Jacob goes through most of his adult life believing that in order to get good things, he has to grab them. When in fact, even before Jacob is even born, God's already decided that Jacob's going to be blessed. And so Jacob goes through a substantial part of his adult life believing and acting on the conviction that whatever good's going to come to him, he's going to have to grab a hold of for himself, when in fact the truth is, every good thing that comes to Jacob is a gift from God. And he finally comes to that realization. So we'll want to watch this kind of spiritual development in Jacob. Well, anyway, Jacob steals his brother's blessing. This actually increases the dysfunction in the family. So one of the interesting things is, and there's another little footnote, right? If you're interested in reading about an inspirational family that has it act together, don't read the book of Genesis. Okay, because one of the things you see the members of this family, the family of Abraham. This is like a really dysfunctional family. They're like each other's throats. There's a lot of competition and, kind of people working different angles and the whole 9 yards. So it's not an inspirational story from a simply human standpoint. Now, one of the most important incidents in Jacob's life is things get so bad, Jacob messes things so much up at home, he has to run away from home. That's the only way you can kind of deal with a situation. His relationship with his brother is so bad, he finally runs away from home. And as he's running away from home, something important happens to him in Genesis 28. Let me read to you what that incident is, because it's, again, one of the most important incidents in the Old Testament. So Jacob is running away from home and running toward relatives in another place. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Let's take a look at what happens here. So Jacob is running away. He's created a mess among his own family, and the only way you can deal with that basically is to leave home. A not unfamiliar story, right? And so while he's running away, he finds himself alone at night, and he has this really interesting dream. It's a dream about a ladder, and the ladder connects heaven and earth. And Jacob sees angels going up and down the ladder. This is a point of connection, literally, where heaven and earth overlap and intersect. And while he's there, Jacob learns something really, really important. Jacob learns in this scene the truth about his life. Now, it takes a while for that truth to set in, and I know this is where you're going to have trouble identifying with Jacob, because I know that all of you, right, probably from the age of 13 on, were like really wise and understood everything that was going on in your lives. Jacob is not like you. He's not as mature as y'all are. Jacob here is told the truth about his life, but it takes a long time for it to sink in. And the truth about Jacob's life is this: I am the Lord your God, the God of your father Isaac, the God of your father Abraham, and I am here to renew the covenant that I made to Abraham and to Isaac with you. I'm telling you right now, Mr. Jacob, that I intend to bless you and your descendants, and I intend to use your descendants to bless all the families of the earth. That is the truth about your life. And of course, it goes in one ear and straight out the other at this point. Now, one thing about this scene that we just want to note here, and I want to underline this for a couple reasons. This little scene occurs later on in the Gospel of John. I just want to point this out just to kind of, see how Scripture is connected in some really profound ways. So this is what happens in John 1:51. Remember, Nathaniel and some other folks come to meet Jesus standing under the tree here in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And this is what Jesus says to Nathaniel, who has come to meet him. Jesus says, Nathaniel says, I've come to you and I want wisdom. And then Jesus says this: truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Notice what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, you know what? There's a point, a place, where heaven and earth intersect, where God and creation come together and meet. And I am that place. I'm the place where God, heaven, and human beings, earth, meet and intersect. I'm that place, the place that Jacob saw back here when he was running away from home. Now, I want to just kind of speed this up to come to the end of Jacob's story, because some really interesting things happen. Along the way, Jacob gets married. He marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and there's an interesting story behind all that. And once again, Jacob kind of, causes all kinds of family conflict and dysfunction. And so he's forced to flee from Leah and Rachel's father, Laban. So wherever Jacob goes, right, his scheming and conniving creates problems. And so he's run away from home to settle, and now he has to leave that place because he's messed everything up there. And while he's on his way back home, a really interesting thing happens. And this is Genesis 32. So Jacob is heading back toward home. He finds himself alone again. While he's on his way back, he learns an interesting fact. One of his employees says, "Oh, Jacob, let me just tell you what I just saw. We're getting close to home. I saw your brother Esau coming out to meet you." And interesting fact, he's got 400 men with him. Do you suppose they're like having like a welcome back party for you? Well, of course, Jacob knows that's not at all what this is about, right? So Jacob is like really getting afraid at this moment. And so he's by himself. It's at night. He's getting ready for this encounter with Jacob. And here is what happens. The same night, he arose and took his 2 wives, his female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. So really important moment, right? This guy who spent all of his adult life scheming and plotting and grabbing and manipulating is left alone to think about all that he's done by himself. So it's a really, really important moment. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said to him, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you asked my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God's face, and my life has been delivered." Now, this is a really important scene. Jacob finds himself in a wrestling match with a figure who seems to be both an angel but also God, and it's really kind of hard to kind of figure it all out. I think one of the best things to do here is just to allow this story to be strange and weird and not try to like sanitize it. But I think we can say this. Notice here that Jacob's name is changed. And this is really important. His name is changed to Israel. Heretofore now, all throughout the Old Testament, the word Israel is now going to mean 2 things. It's going to refer to an individual, Jacob, Israel. It's also going to refer to the people of Israel. But notice here what the name Israel means here. Israel means something like he who strives with God and men. Now I think, this story can be read a number of ways. I'll just suggest one possible meaning, which I think is helpful. I think one of the things we're getting here in this story is Israel's own perception of herself. That is, in Israel's self-perception, they see their relationship with God as, yes, it is a blessing, no question about that, but there's also a sense in which it's also a struggle. That is, in their own sinfulness, right, and their own kind of refusal to trust God, their relationship with God becomes something of an ongoing struggle, almost like a tug of war between them and God, right? They're pulling one way, God's pulling another. Of course, we know who's going to win, right? You can't win a tug of war with God. But I think the point's this, right? We're learning something really important about the people of Israel. They are called, they are chosen, they are graced, they are blessed. But that blessing doesn't always appear to be a lovely and wonderful thing all the time. And the reason why that's the case is because, right, in their own sinfulness, they're resisting that blessing. And so this relationship is a struggle. And it will continue to be a struggle until they change, okay? One final thing, and this is how the story of Jacob basically comes to an end. So Jacob and his brother Esau actually do meet. And I want to read to you how this actually happens. So here's what happens. They meet And this is what happens in Genesis 33:4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, and they and their children bowed down, and Leah likewise with her children drew near and bowed down. At last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. And Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" And Jacob answered, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, "I have enough, brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, please, I have found favor in your sight. Then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." Notice what's going on here. Jacob has encountered his brother and believed that there was only one thing he could expect from Esau, and that is to be killed. And yet something really different's happened. Esau has come to his brother Jacob who has cheated him, and Jacob has welcomed him and embraced him. And that's when Jacob has his moment of truth. He stands back and he says, "You know what? Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. For the way that you have treated me has been totally beyond anything that I've ever deserved. I harmed you, I did you wrong, and you have come to embrace me, to welcome me, and to see me as your brother. And so seeing your face, brother, is like seeing the gracious and welcoming and reconciling face of God." And that's when Jacob has his moment of truth. Jacob comes to the realization that his life actually hasn't been about what he's been able to grab, what he's been able to steal, what he's been able to manipulate. He's come to the realization that every good thing that has ever come to him has been graciously given to him by God, including reconciliation with his brother Esau. Next week, we'll pick things up. And we will conclude the book of Genesis by looking at the Joseph cycle. And we'll find out how Joseph gets a high-level corporate job in the kingdom of Egypt.